He was a sentinel of the old guard, a man whose name was synonymous with impenetrable security. Julian Vance, chairman of Ethelred Security, had built a fortress of digital trust around America's financial institutions. Yet now, that fortress was crumbling from the inside out, betrayed by a single, phantom vulnerability in their flagship system, Guardian. A flaw his own hand-picked legion of cybersecurity experts couldn't find. He had fled the sterile war room, with its frantic whispers of federal audits and catastrophic data breaches, for the comforting anonymity of a late-night diner, seeking refuge from the storm he could no longer control. But then, through the steam-fogged path-through to the kitchen, he saw something that stopped his heart. A waitress, her brow furrowed in concentration, was deftly manipulating a rugged, old tablet. On its screen was not a social media feed or a game, but a stark black command line interface, scrolling with esoteric lines of cryptographic code he hadn't seen in 20 years. She wasn't just killing time. She was dissecting ghosts. And in that gut-wrenching moment, Julian Vance realized the key to saving his father's legacy might not lie with his six-figure analysts, but in the work-roughened hands of the young woman who had just refilled his water glass without a word. The biting Chicago wind, a familiar November adversary, did nothing to cool the glacial dread icing Julian Vance's veins. It howled against the triple-paned windows of his penthouse office, a sound that usually comforted him, the sound of his city. Tonight, it sounded like a chorus of accusers. From his vantage point high above the Chicago Loop, the city was a sprawling circuit board of light, a testament to order and function. It was a lie. His world, the hidden world of secure transactions and data integrity that underpinned the glittering facade below, was in chaos. On the massive wall-mounted monitor, a single ominous icon pulsed in the center of a network diagram. It was a stylized key, colored a venomous red. His team had nicknamed it the Ghost Key. For 3 weeks, this Ghost Key had been their tormentor. It represented a zero-day exploit in the Guardian system, a vulnerability so subtle, so profoundly insidious, that it defied detection by their most advanced diagnostic suites. It allowed for intermittent, untraceable data access at the deepest level of their clients' networks, banks, investment firms, even the Federal Reserve's clearinghouse system. No data had been stolen or altered yet, but the door was wide open. A whisper had become a roar, and now the federal regulators were demanding answers with a deadline that felt less like a date and more like an executioner's countdown. 48 hours. His head of cybersecurity, Marcus Thorne, a slick, confident man with a pedigree from MIT and a salary that could fund a small startup, was out of answers. He and his team of young, brilliant, and arrogant analysts had been working around the clock. They spoke a language of kernel panics and heuristic algorithms, their initial confidence curdling into a defensive, finger-pointing panic. Their latest marathon session had ended an hour ago, not with a solution, but with Thorne suggesting they take the entire system offline, an act that would be a public admission of catastrophic failure, effectively a death sentence for Ethelred Security. "That's not an answer, Marcus. It's a surrender," Julian had said, his voice a low growl that silenced the room. "Find it." Now, alone in the cavernous silence of his office, the weight of his inheritance pressed down on him. He was Julian Vance, son of Arthur Vance, the man who had practically invented modern digital security. Arthur was a legend, a pioneer who wrote code with the elegance of a poet and the paranoia of a spy. Julian was not. He was a businessman, a strategist. He knew how to build a company, how to manage egos, how to sell trust. But he couldn't fight this ghost himself. He hadn't written a line of code. in 30 years. He felt a helplessness that clawed at him, a terrifying echo of the day his father had handed him the keys to the kingdom, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Are you worthy? He needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his own failure. He shrugged on a heavy wool overcoat, a silent sentinel in his closet that had belonged to his father, and took the express elevator down. He waved off his driver, a loyal man named George, who had been with his family for 40 years, and started walking. He didn't have a destination. He just let the raw energy of the city swallow him. He walked for blocks, a man adrift in a sea of steel and light, the grand architecture of the financial district, feeling like a collection of tombstones bearing his name. His wandering eventually led him to a corner of the city that time seemed to have forgotten. Tucked between a new glass and steel condo building and a shuttered bookstore was a diner. The Silver Comet. Its neon sign flickered with a warm, inviting glow, casting pools of pink and blue light onto the wet pavement. It was a relic, an old-world haven of chrome and red vinyl, promising coffee that was always on and a quiet corner to disappear into. It was the absolute antithesis of his life. He pushed open the heavy glass door, a small bell announcing his arrival. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and frying bacon. The low hum of conversations and the clink of cutlery were a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. A hostess with a kind, tired face led him to a booth in the back, the vinyl cracked but comfortable. He ordered a black coffee and a piece of apple pie he had no intention of eating. He just needed to sit, to think. As he nursed his coffee, letting the heat seep into his hands, he watched the staff. They moved with an economy of motion, born of endless repetition, a practiced choreography of service. His gaze settled on one waitress. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, practical bun. Her movements were sharp, precise, and efficient. There was no wasted energy, no idle chatter. When she refilled a customer's coffee, her eyes were already scanning the next table, anticipating their needs. Her name tag, pinned to a crisp white uniform, read Clara. There was an intense focus about her, a quiet intelligence in her dark, observant eyes that seemed out of place amidst the clatter and grease. She carried a coiled stillness, as if the diner were merely a stage for her body, while her mind was operating in a different, more complex world. He watched her for nearly an hour, a welcome distraction from the pulsing red key in his mind's eye. Then he saw her glance at the clock on the wall, a subtle shift in her posture. She said a few words to the older hostess, then disappeared through a set of swinging doors into the kitchen. He assumed it was her break. He sipped his now lukewarm coffee. 5 minutes passed. 10. The kitchen doors were a constant blur of motion, cooks, busboys, other servers, but Clara didn't re-emerge. A flicker of idle curiosity, a welcome respite from his crushing anxiety, got the better of him. The men's room was down a short, narrow corridor, just past the kitchen entrance. As he walked by, one of the swinging doors opened for a moment, as a busboy hustled out with a tray of dirty dishes. Julian glanced inside. The kitchen was a chaotic ballet of steam, stainless steel, and shouted orders. But tucked away in a cramped, dimly lit alcove behind a rack of cooling pies, he saw her. Clara. She wasn't on her phone or smoking a cigarette. She was hunched over a thick, battered-looking tablet, the kind used in industrial settings, its screen glowing in the gloom. Her fingers moved with a blur of controlled speed across a connected keyboard. It wasn't the casual tap of someone messaging a friend. It was the fluid, rhythmic dance of a creator, a builder. He stopped, his hand hovering over the men's room door. He leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look at her screen. It was a command line interface, stark white text on a black background. It was filled with lines of code, and then his blood ran cold. He saw a function call init ors, legacy a padding, and a reference to an old, obscure encryption standard, one that had been deprecated for decades, but was rumored to still exist, buried deep in the foundational architecture of older financial systems. It was an arcane dialect of code, a ghost language, and it was terrifyingly, impossibly familiar. It was the language his father used to speak. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The noise of the kitchen faded to a dull, distant roar. A waitress in a Chicago diner, on a beat-up tablet, was navigating the very digital catacombs his team had dismissed as irrelevant, the foundational code upon which Guardian had been built. It was preposterous. It was a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. And yet, it was happening. He forgot about the men's room, forgot about his pie, forgot about the 48-hour deadline. He forgot everything except the impossible sight of the young woman in the kitchen, weaving digital incantations amidst the scent of old coffee and fried onions. For a full minute, Julian Vance stood rooted to the spot, a statue carved from disbelief. His mind, a machine built for logical deduction and risk assessment, had seized completely. Every rational part of him screamed coincidence, a student working on a project, a hobbyist exploring retro coding. But the code he'd seen, it wasn't academic. The syntax was lean, efficient, written by someone who understood not just the what, but the why. It was the signature of a native speaker, not a tourist. He drew a slow breath, the air thick with the competing smells of bleach and simmering soup. This was madness, but his company was 48 hours from ruin. What was left to lose? His dignity. That had been shredded hours ago in a room full of his own highly paid, clueless experts. Desperation was a key that unlocked doors you never knew existed. He pushed the swinging door open and stepped into the kitchen's cacophony. A wall of heat and noise hit him. "Hey, staff only!" A line cook with a formidable mustache yelled without looking up from his grill. Julian ignored him. His focus was entirely on Clara. She hadn't seen him. Her concentration was absolute, a small frown etched between her brows, her lower lip caught between her teeth. He navigated the cramped space, stepping around a bin of potato peels, and approached her small, makeshift workstation. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil within him. Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes widened, first with the surprise of being interrupted, then with the reflexive panic of an employee caught doing something other than her job. She instantly slapped the cover down on her tablet. "Sir, you can't be back here. Is everything all right with your order?" The waitress was back, a shield of professional courtesy instantly erected. "My order is fine," Julian said, his gaze fixed on the closed tablet. "The problem is with a potential exploit in a system using a deprecated PKIA ORSA 1 v1.5 padding scheme in its legacy RSA implementation." The effect of his words was seismic. The professional mask didn't just crack, it vaporized. Clara's jaw fell slack. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and young under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her eyes, which he had noted as merely intelligent, now sharpened into something analytical, assessing, and deeply suspicious. She didn't feign ignorance. She didn't ask what he was talking about. She knew. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Julian Vance." He watched for the spark of recognition and saw it flare, a subtle but unmistakable widening of her eyes. She knew the name. Anyone who followed the industry, even casually, new Ethelred security. She looked from his expensive, hand-tailored suit to his face, the pieces clicking into place with an audible snap. "Ethelred," she breathed. "Guardian." It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis. "You've heard about the problems," Julian stated, the last shreds of his skepticism burning away. "I read the quarterly security bulletins, the chatter on the deep web forums. You have a ghost," she said, her voice still low, guarded. She clutched the edge of her tablet as if it were a shield. "You're in trouble. The feds are getting involved. The feds will dismantle my company in 2 days if we don't find a ghost that my entire cybersecurity division can't see," he said, laying his cards on the table. There was no room for pretense. "What were you just working on?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the head cook, who was now watching them with open-mouthed curiosity. "A personal project. I'm interested in retro-cryptography." "Don't," Julian said, his voice soft but edged with an intensity that made her flinch. "I saw the code. You were analyzing handshake protocols between a modern authentication layer and a legacy encryption core. Am I wrong?" She swallowed hard, her knuckles white where they gripped the tablet. "No," she admitted quietly. "You're not wrong. I want you to look at our system," Julian said, the words feeling both insane and perfectly logical as they left his mouth. "The Guardian source code." She stared at him, as if he'd just asked her to build a rocket ship out of pie tins. "What? Sir, I'm a waitress. 5 minutes ago, you were a cryptographer. Which one is the real you?" he countered. "I will pay you, a consulting fee, a significant one. You can sign any non-disclosure agreement my lawyers can devise. Just look at it." Clara's mind was visibly at war with itself. He could see the storm in her eyes. Fear, disbelief, and a flicker of something else, a deep, academic hunger. "Why me? You have the best analysts in the world." "The best analysts in the world have been staring at the problem for 3 weeks and see nothing. They're looking at the new building, admiring the architecture, while the foundations are cracking underneath them," Julian said, the metaphor coming to him with sudden clarity. "They think anything old is irrelevant. You don't. You have nothing to lose, and frankly, neither do I." He saw the conflict in her. This was a golden ticket, a fantasy opportunity dropped into the middle of her mundane life, but it was also terrifying. The pressure, the risk of failure and humiliation was immense. I can't," she stammered, shaking her head. "I don't have a degree. I was at the University of Illinois, computer science, but I had to drop out. Family reasons. I've been working here since. I do this to keep my mind busy." The confession hung in the air, thick with the ghosts of lost potential. She wasn't just a hobbyist. She had been on the path. Life had simply thrown up a roadblock. This didn't deter Julian. It solidified his resolve. This wasn't a random fluke. This was a thoroughbred stuck in a plough horse's harness. "I don't give a damn about a degree, Clara," he said, his voice firm. "A degree is a receipt that proves you paid for an education. What I saw on that screen proves you have one. I care about what you can do. The ghost key isn't a flaw in our new code. I'm convinced of it. It's an echo, an old vulnerability in the foundation that the new system is somehow amplifying. It's letting someone jiggle an old lock until it opens. Does that sound like a problem you'd find interesting?" He watched as he laid out his theory, her expression changing. The fear was still there, but it was being eclipsed by the intense, analytical focus he'd seen when she was at her keyboard. The waitress was gone. The engineer was listening. "An amplification vector," she murmured, almost to herself. It wouldn't be in the new code itself, but in the API calls, the way the new system requests authentication from the old one. If the new module is too efficient, it could be overwhelming the legacy core's error checking, creating a momentary window, a timing attack. Her insight was instantaneous, a theory so plausible and specific that it made the hair on his arms stand up. His team had been looking for a battering ram, and she was suggesting it was a picklock. Julian pulled a heavy black metal business card from his wallet. "Ethelred Tower. Be there at 9 a.m. Ask for me. I'll handle security." He placed the card on top of her closed tablet. "Name your price, Clara. Whatever you think is fair. I'll double it." Her hand trembled as she looked at the card. The simple embossed silver logo was a passport to a different universe. "Sir, your coffee," she started, the ingrained habits of her job kicking in. "Forget the coffee," Julian said, turning to leave. He paused at the swinging door and looked back. She was staring at the card, her expression a maelstrom of terror and hope. 9 a.m., Clara. Don't make me beg." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving the heat and the chaos behind him. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a reckless gambler's thrill he hadn't experienced in decades. It was the single most illogical, unprofessional, and desperate decision of his entire career. It was either the move that would save his father's legacy, or the final, pathetic act of a drowning man grasping at a straw. As he stepped back into the quiet diner, he had no idea which it would be. The lobby of Ethelred Tower was a temple to silent, intimidating power. The floors were polished black granite, the walls were cold slabs of grey marble, and the only sound was the whisper of a waterfall cascading down a 3-story stone facade. Men and women in impeccably tailored suits moved with the silent, predatory grace of sharks, their faces illuminated by the glow of their smartphones. The air itself seemed to hum with wealth and consequence. It was a world designed to make outsiders feel insignificant. To Clara Hayes, clutching the strap of the worn messenger bag that held her tablet and a change of clothes, it was succeeding. She had spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, the black business card a weight on her nightstand. She had researched the Ethelred situation, diving into technical forums and security blogs, her mind racing with possibilities. She had arrived wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a pair of simple black slacks and a grey blouse that felt as flimsy as paper armour in this corporate citadel. "I'm here to see Julian Vance," she told the receptionist, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waterfall. "My name is Clara Hayes." The receptionist, a man who looked like he had been sculpted from ice, typed her name into his system. His perfectly manicured eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Of course, Miss Hayes. Mr. Vance is expecting you. 50th floor." He gestured to a private elevator bank, and a door slid open for her with a soft, expensive chime. The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching climb into the heavens. When the doors opened, Julian Vance was waiting. He looked different here, in his domain. The weariness of the previous night was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute command. "Clara." "Good," he said with a curt nod. "Let's not waste any time." He led her through a labyrinth of glass-walled offices. Heads turned, conversations paused. She felt their eyes on her, calculating, curious, dismissive. They were assessing her simple clothes, her cheap bag, her very presence. The feeling of being an imposter was a physical weight on her shoulders. They entered a large, sterile conference room. The air was thick with tension and the smell of burnt coffee. This was the Guardian team. A dozen of them, mostly young men, looked up as Julian entered with Clara in tow. Their faces were etched with fatigue, but their expressions sharpened with suspicion as they saw her. "Everyone, this is Clara Hayes," Julian announced, his tone leaving no room for debate. "She's a specialist consultant who will be providing a fresh set of eyes on our foundation-level architecture. Give her unrestricted access, source code, server logs, schematics, everything. She reports directly to me." A stunned silence hung in the air. The engineers exchanged wary, resentful glances. One man, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Clara's rent for a year, leaned back in his chair. He had a sharp, angular face and a condescending smirk that seemed to be a permanent feature. A nameplate on the table read, "Marcus Thorne, Head of Cybersecurity." "A specialist," Thorne said, his voice slick with skepticism. He looked Clara up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn-out sneakers. "From which firm, may I ask? Or perhaps you could share your doctoral thesis with us, Ms. Hayes. I'm sure we'd all be fascinated." The challenge was clear, a public attempt to humiliate her before she'd even logged in. The other engineers watched, a pack waiting to see if the Alpha would accept the newcomer. Before Clara could find her voice, Julian cut in, his words like chips of ice. "Her credentials are that she has my confidence, Marcus. That's all you need to know. Get her a terminal." The rebuke silenced Thorne, but his dark eyes smoldered with resentment. He gestured dismissively to a junior analyst. "Gary, get our consultant set up on a guest workstation." Gary, a nervous young man with dark circles under his eyes, led Clara to a small, isolated desk in a corner, far from the main cluster of the team. As he hastily provisioned her access, he spoke in a hushed, apologetic tone. "Don't mind Marcus," he whispered. "He's protective of the project. He designed the Guardian authentication layer himself." "And it's a beautiful layer," Clara said quietly, her eyes already fixed on a large architectural diagram on the wall. "But a penthouse is only as strong as the bedrock it's built on." Once she had access, the world around her dissolved. The resentful stares, the intimidating environment, the smug presence of Marcus Thorne. It all faded away. Before her, on a state-of-the-art monitor, was the Ethelred source code. It was a universe unto itself, a sprawling digital metropolis of staggering complexity. She spent the first several hours not trying to fix anything, but simply listening. She read the code, not as a set of instructions, but as a story. She saw the elegant, paranoid, and brilliantly complex foundational code written by Arthur Vance decades ago, the bedrock, and then she saw the modern Guardian layer built on top of it by Thorne's team. It was slick, fast, and aggressive, and the two parts spoke to each other in a language of compromise and translation through a series of application programming interfaces, or APIs. Thorne's team had been searching for a flaw in the penthouse, in their own pristine code. But Clara, guided by her conversation with Julian and her own instincts, went straight to the basement. She focused on the bedrock, the code that handled the most fundamental cryptographic operations. It was old, written in a less fashionable programming language, and she suspected it had been treated by Thorne's team as a black box, a piece of legacy infrastructure to be tolerated, not understood. By late afternoon, she started to see it. It wasn't a bug, it was a feature of the old system that the new system was abusing without realizing it. The bedrock code had a built-in fail-safe, a tiny, deliberate delay in its response to a failed password attempt, designed to frustrate brute force attacks. A fraction of a second, insignificant on its own. But Thorne's new Guardian system, in its quest for hyper-efficiency, didn't just send one authentication request at a time. When under heavy load, it sent hundreds of simultaneous requests. Most would succeed, but a few would fail for various legitimate reasons. When they failed, the Guardian system would immediately retry, hammering the old bedrock with a barrage of requests. The bedrock, dutifully executing its decades-old instructions, would respond to each failure with its tiny, fractional second delay. When hundreds of these tiny delays were triggered at once, they created a cumulative effect, a brief, system-wide stutter, a window of opportunity lasting mere milliseconds, where the system's internal state was momentarily out of sync. It was a timing attack, just as she'd suspected. The ghost key wasn't a key at all. It was the echo of 1,000 tiny stumbles, creating one big fall. To prove it, she needed to see the hardware-level interaction logs from the primary servers. She found Gary. "I need kernel-level access logs for the production servers," she said. Gary blanched. I can't do that. That's a Marcus Thorne-only authorization. Security protocol." Clara walked over to Thorne's glass-walled office. He was on the phone, laughing loudly, one polished shoe propped on his desk. He saw her coming and deliberately made her wait, prolonging his call. When he finally hung up, he looked at her with an expression of profound boredom. "Yes?" "I need kernel log access," she stated, her voice even. He scoffed, a short, derisive sound. "Absolutely not. We don't give temporary consultants root access to our core infrastructure. That would be monumentally irresponsible. I'm tracking a cumulative latency issue between the Guardian API and the Bedrock authentication module. The application logs don't have the necessary resolution." "I think it's a timing vulnerability," she explained, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "A timing vulnerability," he sneered, as if the concept were absurd. "Ms. Hayes, my team is composed of the finest cybersecurity experts on the planet. We have built the most secure financial platform in history. I can assure you, if there were a timing vulnerability, we would have found it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." He swiveled his chair back to his computer, a clear dismissal. He was stonewalling her. It wasn't about security, it was about ego. He couldn't bear the thought of an outsider, a waitress with no credentials, finding a flaw in his whore system. He saw her not as a resource, but as a threat to his authority. Frustrated but not defeated, Clara returned to her desk. If he wouldn't give her the key to the front door, she would have to find a window. She couldn't see the root cause directly, so she would have to prove its existence by meticulously mapping its effects. She began to write a custom script, a piece of software designed to do one thing: send carefully timed, conflicting authentication requests to the system, and listen with microsecond precision for the echo, for the stutter she knew was there. She worked long into the night. The team left one by one, casting curious glances her way. Marcus Thorne departed with a smug, knowing look, as if her continued presence was simply confirmation of her incompetence. Only Julian Vance remained, a solitary figure in his office high above, watching her as the city lights glittered like a fallen constellation. A cold, grim determination settled over Clara. Thorne saw her as an amateur. The team saw her as an oddity. But she knew she was close. The ghost in the machine was real, and it had left footprints. She was the only one who knew what kind of shoes it was wearing. The lion's den was hostile and unwelcoming, but she hadn't come to be liked. She had come to hunt. The next 24 hours were a blur of caffeine and code. Clara's temporary desk became her universe, a small island in a sea of corporate grey. The script she built, which she named Echo Finder, was her divining rod. She ran it against a sandboxed simulation of the Guardian system, and the results began to paint a damning picture. The stutter was real, and it wasn't random. It only appeared under a very specific, high-frequency load, precisely the kind of traffic a major financial clearinghouse would generate at peak hours. Late on the second night, with the federal deadline looming like a headsman's axe, she found the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just that the stutter created a window, it was what the window exposed. During that millisecond-long state of confusion, a single, specific error code generated by the bedrock was being misinterpreted by the Guardian layer. Instead of seeing it as access denied, Guardian was misreading it as awaiting secondary authentication. For a fraction of a second, the system would grant a provisional, low-level access token, expecting a second password that never came. It was a crack in the armor, just wide enough for a phantom to slip through. A wave of dizzying, bone-tired elation washed over her. She had done it. She had found the ghost. The fix was conceptually simple, but surgically precise. It required a two-part solution. First, a small patch to the Guardian layer to correctly interpret the legacy error code. Second, and more importantly, a modification to the API to prevent it from overwhelming the bedrock with simultaneous retries, a throttling mechanism. It was a change of maybe 20 lines of code to save a multi-billion-dollar company. Her first instinct was to sprint to Julian's office. But she stopped herself. She needed to present it perfectly. She wrote a clear, concise report, detailing the vulnerability, her methodology for finding it, and the proposed two-part fix. She included the logs from Echo Finder as irrefutable proof. She saved it all to a secure folder on the local development server. She named the directory Guardian Solution CH, her initials, a quiet claim of ownership. It was 3:15 a.m. She decided to rest her eyes for just a couple of hours in a small, unused lounge before presenting her complete findings to Julian at dawn. The hunt was over. But she hadn't been hunting alone. Marcus Thorne had been watching, consumed by a toxic cocktail of professional arrogance and mortal fear. He could not stomach the possibility that this dropout waitress could succeed where he had so publicly failed. He'd seen her fanatical, round-the-clock focus. Earlier that day, under the guise of optimizing network traffic, he had installed a packet sniffer on the subnet that included her guest workstation. It was a flagrant abuse of his administrative privileges, but he rationalized it as monitoring a potential internal threat. From the comfort of his home office, he had watched her digital ghost. He saw her script, Echo Finder, hammering the simulation server. He saw the precise, rhythmic nature of the attack. And then he saw the logs. He watched, his blood turning to ice, as she isolated the timing window and the error code misinterpretation. He saw her discover the fundamental flaw in his brilliant, hyper-efficient authentication layer. It was his design that was breaking the system. Raw panic gave way to a cold, reptilian cunning. She had found it, but she hadn't told anyone yet. She was a nobody, a ghost herself, with no standing, no allies. He, on the other hand, was the head of cybersecurity. It was his system, his team. Whose story was more believable? Working with a frantic, feverish haste, he replicated her discovery. It was simple now that she had drawn him a map. He copied her logic, rephrasing her explanation in his own corporate jargon. He wrote his own version of the code patches, making a few cosmetic changes to variable names so they weren't exact duplicates. He packaged it all into a new presentation. Then, with a final, venomous act, he used his high-level credentials to navigate the server. He found her folder, Guardian Solution CH, and deleted it. He then went a step further, manually wiping the specific server logs that would show his access and deletion. He covered his tracks. Her proof was gone. At 6:30 a.m., just as Clara was stirring on a stiff leather sofa, Marcus Thorne sent an email to Julian Vance and the entire executive board. The subject line was a trumpet blast of victory. Urgent. Breakthrough. Guardian vulnerability. Identified and neutralized. The email began. After a final, exhaustive diagnostic push led by my office, I am pleased to report that my team has successfully isolated and solved the core issue creating the ghost key vulnerability. The flaw was a subtle race condition in the legacy architecture, which our Guardian system's advanced heuristics have now managed to identify. A patch is ready for immediate deployment. A full technical debriefing will be held in the main boardroom at 9 a.m. He had stolen her discovery, her vindication, her moment of triumph, and twisted it into his own. The stage was set for his coronation, and Clara Hayes was about to walk onto it, completely unaware that her ghost had been vanquished, only to be replaced by a monster of flesh and blood. Clara walked into the 9 a.m. board meeting, feeling a profound sense of nervous excitement. She clutched her tablet, its screen holding the report that was her vindication. The elegant simplicity of the two-part solution was a source of deep, quiet pride. She had slept for less than 3 hours, but the pure adrenaline of discovery was a more potent stimulant than any coffee. She entered the 50th floor boardroom, and the scene stopped her cold. It was a celebration. Marcus Thorne was at the head of the table, surrounded by jubilant engineers and beaming board members who were clapping him on the back. Julian Vance stood by the window, his posture relaxed for the first time in weeks, a look of immense relief on his face. He caught Clara's eye and gave her a small, appreciative nod, which she tragically misinterpreted as a sign that he'd seen her report and was waiting for her to present it. "A masterclass in diagnostics, Marcus. Truly," a portly board member named Henderson was saying. "You pulled the company back from the brink." Marcus smiled, an expression of magnanimous, false humility. "It was a team effort. We never gave up. We simply had to pivot our focus and analyze the interaction between the Guardian API and the Bedrock's core processes. A deeply embedded timing issue, but we cornered it." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. Timing issue. Guardian API. Bedrock. He was using her words, her exact discovery. A wave of icy dread, so intense it made her physically sick, washed over her. Julian turned his attention to the room. "Marcus, show us." With the smug air of a magician revealing his trick, Marcus projected his presentation onto the main screen. He showed the code for the 2 patches, his cosmetically altered versions, and explained the logic with the unearned confidence of a man who had understood it for approximately 3 hours. He detailed how the high-frequency API calls created a cumulative latency, how the misinterpreted error code opened a momentary vulnerability. He presented it all as the heroic culmination of his team's sleepless nights. Clara stood by the door, frozen in stunned, disbelieving silence. He had stolen it. He had picked her mind clean and presented the contents as his own. She looked at the faces of the other engineers, even young Gary. They believed him completely. Why wouldn't they? He was their boss, their leader. She was just the strange girl who had sat in the corner for 2 days. "Excellent work," Julian said, and the 2 words were a physical blow to Clara's stomach. He finally turned to her. "Clara, thank you. Your input was clearly valuable in helping the team re-examine the legacy systems. Please see my assistant about your consulting fee. We'll make sure it's substantial." He was dismissing her. A thank you and a check. He thought she had been a minor catalyst, a helpful nudge, while Marcus was the one who had delivered the cure. The injustice of it was a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth. She started, her voice trembling. "That's my solution. That's my work." Marcus let out a short, pitying chuckle. "Ms. Hayes, I understand the desire to be a part of a historic win like this. But let's not get carried away. The commit logs, the server records, they will all show my team's work. He was right. Her folder, her Echo Finder script, her report, it was all gone. She had no proof. I found it last night, around 3 a.m., she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. I wrote a script, Echo Finder, to prove the timing vulnerability. A script? Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. We have multi-million-dollar diagnostic suites. We don't rely on amateur scripts. Mr. Vance, I believe the pressure of the situation may be causing some confusion for our consultant. Every eye in the room was on her. She looked exactly like what he was painting her as, a fraud, a delusional nobody trying to steal a slice of the glory. She looked at Julian, her eyes pleading. She saw the relief in his face, at war with a tiny, nascent flicker of doubt. He was a systems man. He remembered her immediate theory in the diner kitchen about a timing attack. He remembered her specific request for kernel logs, which Marcus had denied. Marcus's sudden, miraculous breakthrough, just hours after stonewalling her, was almost too perfect. The important thing is that it's fixed, Julian said, his voice a neutral mask, clearly trying to end the deeply uncomfortable moment. We can deploy the patch and inform the regulators. The meeting moved on. Marcus was the hero. Clara was an awkward footnote, a ghost at a feast that should have been in her honor. Utterly defeated, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, the sound of their relieved laughter and planning fading behind her. She hadn't failed to find the ghost in the machine. She had failed to account for the monster sitting at the head of the table. But Julian Vance hadn't built an empire by accepting things at face value. He was a man who trusted systems, and the system of Marcus's sudden victory had too many convenient variables. Clara's desperate, specific claims, a script named Echo Finder, the 3 a.m. timing. It all felt too detailed to be a simple fabrication. He contrasted her raw, unpolished brilliance in the diner with Marcus's slick political maneuvering. While the boardroom buzzed with relief, Julian excused himself and returned to the solitude of his office. He didn't call his security team. A corporate investigation could be managed, contained, and buried. This, he had to do himself. He sat at his personal terminal, the one with unrestricted, God-level access to the entire Ethelred network. He was still his father's son. He knew his way around the digital plumbing. First, he ran a global file search for Echo Finder. Nothing. It must have been on her local guest workstation, which would have been wiped clean. Next, he searched for the directory she would have created, Guardian Solution CH. It didn't exist. As Marcus had promised, her proof was gone. But Julian knew that on their high-redundancy servers, deleted wasn't the same as gone forever. Files were marked for overwrite, their ghosts lingering in the magnetic ether. He initiated a deep-level forensic scan of the development server's unallocated space, a time-consuming process. While it ran, he meticulously examined the server's administrative command logs. These were a level above simple access logs. They recorded every privileged action taken by any administrator. He saw Marcus's activity around 6 a.m., committing the new code. It looked clean, too clean. A man covering his tracks often sweeps the floor so hard he leaves marks from the broom. Julian expanded his search, filtering for any destructive or obfuscating commands in the 12 hours prior. And then he found it. A digital smoking gun. At 3:42 a.m., Marcus Thorne's administrative account had executed a shred U command, not a simple delete, but a military-grade command designed to overwrite a file's data multiple times before deleting it, making recovery nearly impossible. The target of the command, a directory named #dev, temp, guardian, solution ch. Immediately following that, at 3:43 a.m., the same account had run a command to manually purge the access log records for that specific directory for the preceding 10 minutes. It was the digital equivalent of a killer burning a body and then bleaching the entire crime scene. Marcus hadn't just removed her work, he had tried to erase the fact that it ever existed. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had purged the file access log, but he couldn't purge the higher-level administrative command log that recorded the act of purging itself. It was an act of supreme arrogance. He never imagined anyone, least of all the chairman, would dig this deep. A cold, precise fury settled in Julian's gut. The forensic scan completed. It had managed to recover fragments of the shredded directory. He pieced them together. There it was, Clara's original report, her beautifully documented code, and the logs from Echo Finder, time-stamped 3:11 a.m. The evidence was absolute. It was a perfect, damning timeline of genius and theft. The betrayal was not just against Clara. It was a betrayal of the very principle of integrity upon which his father had founded the company. It was a cancer in the heart of his organization. He picked up his desk phone. He didn't call security or HR. He called Henderson, the senior board member. "Robert," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Get everyone back in the boardroom, now. The victory party is over." The atmosphere in the boardroom was one of puzzled curiosity. The engineers and executives filed back in, their faces still flushed with relief. Marcus Thorne strode in with the easy confidence of a man who had just saved the world, accepting another round of congratulations. He took his place at the head of the table, a king on his throne, already mentally calculating the size of his bonus. Clara was not present. Julian had sent his personal assistant to find her, asking her to wait in the quiet sanctuary of his office. He needed her away from the blast zone. When the door sealed, Julian remained standing by the main display, a dark, imposing figure. The cheerful chatter in the room withered and died under the weight of his cold silence. "Our celebration," Julian began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "was premature. We have found the solution to the Guardian problem, but the credit has been given to the wrong person. The real story reveals a failure of character within this company that is far more dangerous than any line of code." A tense, electric shock went through the room. Marcus Thorne's confident smile faltered, replaced by a mask of wary confusion. "Marcus," Julian said, his eyes locking onto his cybersecurity chief, "you told us your team found the solution in an all-night push. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right," Marcus affirmed, his voice losing some of its smooth timbre. "It was a matter of pursuing a new line of inquiry." "A new line of inquiry?" Julian interrupted, his voice laced with chilling sarcasm. "That's fascinating, because the actual solution was found, documented and finalized at 3:14 this morning by Clara Hayes." With a tap on his console, the main screen behind him lit up. It was not Marcus's polished presentation. It was a raw, undeniable image of the forensically recovered directory, Guardian Solution ch. Displayed for all to see were the fragments of Clara's pristine report, her elegant code, and the Echo Finder logs, the timestamp a glowing brand of truth. Gasps rippled through the room. The engineers stared, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. Marcus Thorne's face went the color of ash. This is a fabrication," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "She must have hacked the server, planted this to frame me, to steal my team's credit." "Did she?" Julian countered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He brought up a second window on the screen, the high-level administrative command log. He highlighted 2 lines in blood red. "Then perhaps you can explain this, Marcus. At 3:42 a.m., your administrative account, and only your account, executed a shred command on that very directory. For our non-technical board members," Julian said, his gaze sweeping the room. "That is not deleting a file. It is digitally incinerating it, and then, 1 minute later, you manually purged the access logs for your actions. You were sloppy, Marcus. In your arrogance, you burned down the evidence but left a security camera recording of you holding the match." The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The digital evidence was a death sentence. Marcus stared at the screen, his mouth half open, his carefully constructed world collapsing into ruin around him. He looked at his team, at the board, and saw only the cold, hard glint of judgment in their eyes. "The greatest threat to this company isn't a bug in the code," Julian said, his voice ringing with the authority of a founder defending his creation. "It's a culture of ego that allows a senior manager to steal the work of a brilliant mind rather than admit that genius can come from anywhere. A culture that dismisses talent because it doesn't have the right diploma on the wall." He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes now devoid of all emotion. "You are fired, effective immediately. Security is waiting for you outside. Collect your personal effects. You are done here." Broken, Marcus pushed his chair back. He stood, his shoulders slumped, and walked toward the door, a man hollowed out by his own deceit. He didn't say a word. As he left, the room remained silent, the lesson hanging heavy in the air. Later, Julian found Clara in his office, standing by the window, looking out at the city she had saved. "It's over," he said softly. She turned, her eyes weary but clear. "He deleted everything. I had no proof." "He tried," Julian corrected her gently, "but you of all people should know. The truth, like good code, always leaves a trace. I'm sorry, Clara, for what he did, and for my own blindness. I was so desperate for a solution, I almost accepted the easy lie instead of the hard truth. That's a failure of my leadership." "I should have been more careful," she whispered. "No," Julian said, his voice firm. "You should be able to do brilliant work without having to watch your back. It's my job to build a place where that's possible, a job I intend to take much more seriously." He paused. "The Silver Comet is probably looking for a new waitress, but Ethelred Security has an opening for a senior analyst in our new Systemic Integrity Group, a division I'm creating today. Its mandate will be to challenge every assumption, to act as our internal adversary, to find the flaws before the world does. It needs a leader who sees the whole building, from the bedrock to the penthouse. The position is yours if you want it." Clara stared at him, the offer too vast to comprehend. I don't have a degree," she whispered, the old insecurity as a stubborn ghost. Julian smiled, a genuine tired smile. "You have something far more valuable. You have the solution. You saw what an army of experts missed. They don't teach that at a university." He extended his hand. "So, Clara Hayes, will you help me fix my company?" A slow smile spread across Clara's face, a sunrise after a long night, erasing the last traces of fear. The waitress was gone. The imposter was gone. In her place stood an architect. "Yes," she said, her voice firm and clear as she shook his hand. "Yes, I will."